I got some notes for this one, but what I want to talk about is some of the safety innovations over the years in NASCAR and where they actually come from. And I think might find this interesting. The idea of shoulder belts in the 60s, some wore them, some didn't. Passenger cars in the 60s had lap belts, and there weren't any seatbelt laws back then. Joe Weatherly, two-time Premier Series champ, 62 and 63, was killed at Riverside in one of the early races in 63. Yes, I know in the 80s Riverside was the first race for the 70s and 80s, but actually NASCAR started the season the previous year counting toward the 64 points, counting toward the next year's points. Well, Joe Weatherly was not wearing a shoulder belt. Also, window nets weren't in existence then. I'll get to that one here in a little bit, but window nets weren't in existence then, but they had the option. The cars actually had the side windows in them. They could roll them up. In fact, Ford after that stipulated that their drivers will run with the windows rolled up at Riverside. The fuel cell, suggested by Smokey Yunick, and this was before the terrible, tragic, fatal crash of Fireball Roberts of Charlotte in 64. 64 was a bad year. The mid 60s was a bad year. Smokey Yunick, who was a pilot, wanted to, and a brilliant mind, Google him, it's Yunick. If you don't know who he is, brilliant man, wanted to adapt fuel cells, and Big Bill France was stubborn. That wasn't stock, and he didn't want them. Well, after the Fireball Roberts crash, they became mandatory. Now, here's something that every NASCAR driver has today: a crotch strap. Two fatal crashes in the mid 60s, Billy Wade and Jimmy Pardue. Now, it's some argument on the NASCAR history until 1972 Facebook site which one of the crashes it was, but it was obviously one of them that brought that in. The Hans device now required. In the 2001 Daytona 500, in the race which Dale Earnhardt lost his life, only Jeff Gordon and one other driver that I can't remember was wearing any type of head and neck restraint device. They became mandatory later that year, I believe, as a result of the Earnhardt crash. I frankly don't think they would have saved Earnhardt. I think there were other problems there with the seatbelt, but that's just my opinion. I've said it in a vlog before. I'm not going into it. The safer barriers. Let's get back to Smokey Yunick again. He was actually building a prototype either in the 60s or 70s using, I've read he used both styrofoam and old tires banded together. And you still see styrofoam barriers at short tracks and even sometimes tires banded together. I mean, you're going to hit hard, but it's better than hitting a concrete wall. Now here's a good one, the window nets, which I briefly touched on. Joe Weatherly did not have one. They were not in existence then in 64. But Richard Petty had a bad crash at Darlington, which he broke his collarbone, I believe. He was at several races. I'm thinking it was his collarbone or shoulder. Not positive. I did not look it up before I started the vlog, but actually, after the Weatherly crash, some teams took, of all things, the shelving out of refrigerators and put it in the driver's side windows, trying to give some protection. But after the Richard Petty crash, I believe it was Elizabeth Petty's, Richard's mother, I believe that's what Kyle told on race day one time, made the first window net anywhere close to what they use today and is required. But that was something that was done by the teams. Now there is some argument that Bill Kimmel, after a bad crash at Daytona, came out with one. That crash happened, I want to say 71. If that crash happened in 71, Richard Petty's crash was in 70, so Petty's would have been first. There's some argument, and I live in the same area as Bill Kimmel, there's some argument he was one of the first, but I don't know that for a fact. Now here's a big one, required, spotters. Where did the idea of spotters come from? This is going to surprise you. Not from NASCAR, the teams. They literally, in the early days of spotters, bought tickets in the grandstands if they had to. Sent a man up there with a two-way radio, could see the whole track. In fact, at ASA and ARCA races at a place like Salem, I sat with spotters down in the unreserved section in turn one. Usually had to deal with them if the scoreboard wasn't working. If I got a lap count off another team's radio, I'd give it to them. I'd do it as long as they'd give me their frequency. Frequencies were hard to come by. Now, two row bars that are referred to as the Petty bar and the Earnhardt bar that are now required, developed by the teams, and you would have to Google it or look up the configuration of them. After a Petty and an Earnhardt crash, I believe I'm not sure which Petty crash it was. I actually don't believe the Earnhardt one was a crash. I believe it's where he had a drive shaft fly up and hit the windshield at Talladega, cut him, but the Big E, tough as nails, went on and finished the race. The great story would be to say he won it, but he didn't. And the last one, pit crew helmets. NASCAR was not the first one to mandate them. Indy cars had them. Cal Wells, who owned the Tide number 32 team, also owned an IndyCar team. He said, my guys are going to wear helmets. And shortly after that, with some trouble on pit road, that if you go back, there's been, I think, 1991, when Bill Elliott had a crew member killed on pit road at Atlanta. Mike Rich was his name. Would have helped, I don't know, but it couldn't have hurt. But it's just somewhere the safety innovations come from, and it's really about 50-50. So many of them come from the teams themselves. That, to me, spotters is a big one. And teams actually, when they first started, spotters had to buy tickets in the grandstands if they didn't give them a place. But then, now of course NASCAR requires them to give them a place. Just, I don't know, enjoy.